My mother was a single mom, had various boyfriends with one husband hanging around. She was a drug addict and alcoholic. When I was 13, we were living in a room in this house way out in the desert. My older sister was 16 and had already moved in with friends. I'm not sure why, but for some reason we had to leave the place we lived in prior, so my mom rented us this room to share. Most of our stuff was in storage. I didn't know the man we lived with. My mom pretty much just came up to me one day and said, "We're moving," and that was that. Anyway, after we had been there about a week or so, I was home one day and my mom was laying on the couch in our room, and she seemed to be slipping in and out of consciousness. I kept trying to wake her up, but she was completely out of it, so I went to go call an ambulance. We didn't have a phone in our room, so I went to the living room to use the phone. Mike, the man we lived with, was on the phone, so I asked if I could use the phone because there was an emergency. My mom was sick and I need to call an ambulance. He ignored me at first, and then got annoyed with me. He wouldn't let me use the phone. So I took off on foot down to the nearest grocery store, probably the equivalent of several city blocks, and used the payphone. By this time I was so panicked that I couldn't even remember the address, so I called a friend of my mom's, and she said she would call an ambulance. She said to stay there and wait, and she would pick me up. By the time she came to pick me up, the ambulance had already come to take my mom to the hospital. I went with her to her house, thinking that once my mom got out of the hospital she would come and get me. Well, she didn't. She left the hospital against medical advice, and to my knowledge, did not contact her friend. To this day, I honestly don't know what was wrong with her. She has said it was a drug overdose. Valium mixed with alcohol, no doubt. And other times she said she had a stroke. She lies all the time and she's crazier than a loon, so I'm sure I'll never know the truth. After a couple of weeks, with still no word from my mom's friend told me that I could no longer stay with her. I had to find another place to live. I called my sister to see if I could stay with her, but her friend's mom said no, she already had 2 kids and plus my sister, so she had no room for me. My sister contacted my aunt and uncle, who I hadn't seen/spoken to in probably a year or more, due to my mother and some other dramatics, I'm sure. They agreed to let me stay with them. I moved in with them with nothing but the clothes I was wearing, plus 1 duffel bag of things. A few clothes, some cassette tapes, stuff like that. After staying with them for a few days, they offered to adopt me. I agreed since I didn't really know what else to do. Finally, after about a month, my mother surfaced. I sat in my cousin's room and waited to find out where I would be living next. I could hear my mother and my uncle yelling at each other. Eventually my mom came into the room and started telling me to pack my shit and get in the car, we were leaving. My uncle came after her, yelling, and I just sort of freaked. I ran out into the backyard to get away from them. I told my mother that I wanted to stay there, and when she had a job and a new place to live I would come live with her. In my 13-year-old, emotional freaked out state, that seemed like the most logical solution. This sparked much dramatics, with my mother accusing me of abandoning her, saying things like "I've never been good enough for you," etc., etc. Basically acting like she was the victim and I was a horrible person for abandoning her in her time of need. Finally she gave me an ultimatum: either go with her now, or never see her again. I chose to stay. I really figured she was bluffing. Eventually she left, and I didn't hear from her for a really long time. I started thinking that perhaps she was serious and that I would never see her again. Then I got a letter from her when I was about 15 years old. It was about 4 to 5 pages long, and it was all about how she forgave me for abandoning her. I tore it up and threw it away. She refuses to admit her wrong.
Next up, abusive mother causes hearing loss.
I was born female. My mother wanted her sacred little boy and hated my dad. She cheated on him and eventually left him for my stepfather, taking me with her for no other purpose than to hurt him. She had her precious, perfect little boy a few months later. From that point forward, I, then 6 years old, was treated like nothing but an inconvenience on the best days. It was clear that I wasn't wanted, and that my mother was doing everything in her power to keep me away from my father out of spite. She'd tell me I was so awful that he wanted nothing to do with me. I later found out that he kept looking, but every time he found out where I was, my mother and stepfather decided it was time to pick up and move. Unfortunately, I grew to resent him and wanted nothing to do with him by the time I was old enough to make any form of decision about seeing him for myself. Fast forward. I had ear infections that were neglected to the point of hearing loss. I was put through enough physical and mental abuse that I wanted to die by the time I was 10. I was ordered to do anything my brother wanted to make him happy. This included being his literal punching bag. Thankfully, he wanted violence and not anything sexual. They also liked to blow off steam by beating the shit out of me whenever they were stressed or in a bad mood for whatever reason. CPS did nothing. My mother and stepfather would be warned before they came. They'd clean the house and warn me that I'd be given to an even worse family that would hate me even more and hurt me even more if I didn't act like a real little girl and tell CPS that it was all a lie, that I was happy, and that I'd do anything to stay with my mommy and daddy. As soon as CPS left, I'd get beaten for making them look bad and having CPS called in the first place. As an adult, I now have hearing aids. My mother has insulted me about them and the hearing loss itself, as if they're character flaws. She also would not allow a phone conversation to end unless I was crying, sometimes to the point of vomiting. My father died of cancer 10 years ago, but we were able to repair our relationship in the 6 years before he passed. My stepfather also died of cancer after he cheated on my mother, gave her Hep C, and divorced her. My brother spent time in prison for vehicular manslaughter as a result of taking recreational Xanax, then striking and killing a trucker who was standing outside of his truck for reasons I still don't know. I believe there were other drugs in his system, too. He and my mother still blame the deceased and insist that the real victim was my brother. I'm 40. This was a year ago. My only regret was that I allowed them to do this to me for so long. I let my mother especially torture me for 39 years that I can't get back, and over a decade of therapy did little to nothing to help me. I still occasionally have trouble even believing I'm a real person. It wasn't bad therapists, the abuse was just that fucking bad. I moved 3,000 miles away almost 20 years ago, and it still wasn't far enough. If anyone is reading this and is still currently in the situation I was in, I only have this to say: run now and do not look back. They won't get better, you don't deserve this, and I don't want you to end up bitter and aged far beyond your years like I am. If I can't be a good example, I at least want to be a good warning. They took away my personhood and a good part of my humanity.